Welcome to the webinar about generational difference and perception. I'm really excited to have each of you here today to talk about this. As we go through the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. Right now I have it so that chats don't go directly to me, just so that there's not a lot of confusion and so that you're not distracted with all of the different things going on. But later on at the end of the webinar, I'll open it up so you can see everything. And then also feel free to use the hashtag WSSWorks on Twitter if that's a social platform that you use. If I don't have the chance to look through tweets as we go through the webinar, I'll be sure to interact afterwards to get some of those questions answered for you. So we're going to get started. As you see above, please make sure that you have at least paper and a pen. The Post-its and envelope and stamp would be awesome to have. They'll be useful, but if you don't have those, you can still get by. You can do most of the things, but you are going to need paper. So we're going to launch right into a whole bunch of things just because we only have an hour of time. First of all, I wanted to make sure that you're all aware that this training is going to be interactive. It's going to be experiential. We're going to be doing things together. So it's not just going to be me talking at you. It's going to be some things are going to happen. And with that, comes our first activity, is this question of, when I think of other generations and their lifestyles, what do I think of? So if you can finish that sentence either in the chat box or on Twitter, that will give us just a place to start a common ground for conversations of, when you think about a different generation, what is it that you're thinking of? Just see as comments come through. All right, so when I think of other generations and their lifestyles, I'm glad I live now. That's a good one. That's a very good one. The idea that, maybe now is the best time. I agree, now is the best time to be living, right? When I think of other generations and their lifestyles, I think of communication styles. That's really important. This idea that we all interact a little differently and it might not all be the same, and that's important to remember. When I think of other generations and their lifestyles, I think of older generations and their lifestyle. Let's see what. I wonder who I would be if I was born then. That's interesting. Like, you have to think about it for a second, but what type of person would I be if I was born then and what my life would look like? It's a very interesting question. So there's a lot of really good ideas of generations and their lifestyles and how there's some difference. We can see there's a lot of comments about how the older generation likes this thing or the younger generation wants this, and how there's so much difference. And that's important to really be aware of when we're talking about generations and the differences that are there, and the similarities that are there. Is that, we all come from this space where we perceive generations in a certain light, depending on our age and our experiences. Just a couple quick things about who I am, because some of you know me fairly well, some of you don't know me really at all. I am a millennial, obviously, so I fit squarely in that age range, and you can see that from the photos there, that I adhere to a lot of those stereotypes, right? Like, I care about animals, I take random pictures about nothing because I can, I have like the hipster love for coffee, but that's not all there is to it. I'm also a woman, I'm also an educator, I'm also the type A data person. There's a lot of pieces to who I am, and so that's really important to be aware of, is that I am a millennial, and that's a piece of my identity, but it isn't everything. And so when we're having this conversation about what it looks like to perceive people generationally, we need to make sure that, especially when we're talking about millennials, but really any generation, that we recognize we're generalizing, and that it's a first step. Our brains need labels to be able to categorize people and things to help us out, right? We need to be efficient. And so when we can label people and put categories around them, it helps us to know initially how to interact with them. But we don't want to get stuck there. We get stuck there, we fall into stereotypes, and we people lose their individuality, and it becomes a problem. And on top of that, the millennial category is huge, right? Like there's millions and millions and millions of people who fit into that category, and it's defined differently depending on who you are. Between 1980 and 1995 as your birth date means you are almost certainly in the millennial category, but on either end, there are people who are considered millennials as well, depending on who you're talking to. So it's really important that we see this as a first step. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of generational kind of analysis. It's a big word, big idea, but we're going to make it really simple. And to do that, you're going to need your 5 pieces of paper. And so I have pretty pink paper here that I'm using. And on your 5 pieces of paper, what I would like you to do is label which of the 5 categories it is. So this is like my college example, and you'll have one that says travel, and one that says dating, and one that says first job, etc. And then on one side, write the word me and have a line, and on the other side, write the word others. Okay? And I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to get all of that like labeling and creating of all of those 5 papers down. And while you're doing that, I'm going to answer a question that was brought up here. The question is, I don't fit into the Gen X category, and I feel so. There's somebody who is saying, "Oh, I don't feel like I fit in the millennial category, but I don't fit in the Gen X category either." I hear that a lot. There's actually like a weird niche category that has been created. It's sometimes referred to as the Oregon trailer category, which is those people that are kind of between Gen X and millennial and don't really feel like they fit in either world. And that's like a special category. But the important thing really isn't actually which category you're a part of. It's you can decide for yourself which things fit you, which things don't. And sometimes it's actually really helpful to not have a category, right? Like to be able to step out of the categories and say, hey, this is kind of ridiculous. Like I don't fit either one. Maybe other people don't fit either of them either. That's a great question. All right, so hopefully you have at least gotten started on these papers. And now that you have at least a few of them finished, what I would like you to do is on the me side, write down experiences that you have had in that area. So this is my college one, like I said. And so on the me side, I will put things like, I went to college for 3 years and I was at a private school and I still have college loans, and I worked 3 jobs through college, and college didn't guarantee me a job in my field, and it felt like I needed to do it, but not that it would get me anywhere, and could keep going and going and going. Write down as many things as you want to on the me side of your personal experience in each of these 5 areas. So that's going to take a little bit of time, and while that's going on, I wanted to bring to the forefront this first tip that I have listed, and that's this idea that younger generations are looking for ways to contribute. And this is true really of any generation, but something that I think is overlooked more with this generation than in the past is this idea that we really are looking for ways to share our knowledge and our expertise, and to be a part of that team and part of that big picture. And so as much as you are able to provide opportunities for conversation and collaboration, the better experience your millennials are going to have with your company. The longer they're going to want to stay, the more they're going to develop, the greater their growth is going to be. And I know for older generations that can sometimes be really hard. Oftentimes it seems like there's this like need to be involved, that they're like reaching farther than they should be. They're trying to take on tasks that aren't in their realm to do. But I would really encourage you to think through all of the ways that your younger generation really could contribute and really be helpful. Um, and figure those out, because as much as you as opportunities as you can give them to be collaborating, it's going to just benefit you and benefit them. And when we're talking about, the talent wars that are going on in a lot of corporations right now, it's really important that we're figuring out ways to keep our young staff in our companies, and providing that opportunity for collaboration is really going to be helpful. All right, how are we doing with getting the me side of those five just started? Are we feeling good about how much we have accomplished? Do we need some more time to go through them? Okay, all right, all right. We'll take a little bit more time. We'll take a little more time. That's all right. All right. For those of you that have finished on the me side, I would like you to start considering the others side. I know it's very much a dichotomy that we have created, but that's going to be helpful for a few reasons. But in the others category, I want you to think about your perception of how others experienced that same thing. So for me, in my college example, one of the things that I think about when I think about others is I think about generations ago, the experience women had with college, and how what didn't used to be as normal for women to go to college in some of the fields that we're going into now. I also think about how the experience of paying for college used to be very different, right? Like, others didn't have to worry so much about student debt. And so that's a difference that I notice. Also, my knowledge of others is, I paid my way through school. I know others' experience is sometimes their parents paid for their schooling. And that's actually across generations, right? That's not a generational thing, but that's others. So take a little bit of time and write down what you are thinking others' experiences of those same things might be. There's some really great information coming in about some different experiences, especially with the dating one. I find that the dating question is always entertaining and interesting to hear the experiences people have had in that realm, but in other areas as well. There's some really interesting stuff. So I'm going to share some of it with the whole group, but it's really fun for me to see some of those nuances, and so some of those interesting aspects of these differences that we experience. So keep working on answering that other side of the page. And this is just a really simple tip that I want to talk about, is this idea of how every generation struggles to understand the others. This isn't unique of millennials. It's every generation. The generation before and the generation after struggles to understand them. It doesn't matter what time period we're talking about. This is a problem that has always existed, and it exists in generation, and it exists anytime there's difference, right? Like, we have a hard time seeing past ourselves and seeing how other people are experiencing and perceiving the world. It's just the way we've been built. And so it's really, really valuable and really important to do your part to try and bridge that gap, to try and get to know other people from other generations and why they interact the way they do and how they function that way. All right, so we're going to move into talking a little bit about each of these areas. So if you haven't quite finished, you can keep doing that while we do this, but also keep an ear on the conversation that happens. All right, so we're going to start with dating because feel like dating breaks the ice a little bit because there's a lot of just like really interesting examples of how different the world can be even 5 or 10 years apart, right? There's so much that has happened in the world of dating since even 10, 15, 20 years ago. So these are just a few examples of what people have said in the past are ways they have experienced dating. So there's your traditional through a friend or dinner and a movie or something like that, where that's kind of the traditional idea of how you go about dating, right? Your friend sets you up with someone, you go out to dinner, you watch a movie, you find out if you like each other, if you're interested in having another date. Especially in smaller towns in the Midwest, the idea of meeting at church is really, really common. That's the place where everyone socializes, so it makes sense. The idea of meeting at a bar, that really person to person, we meet, we find out a little bit about each other, we go on a date, we figure out from there. And then as we progress more and more into technology, the ways people interact, there's some that are exactly the same, still dinner and a movie, still meeting at church, that kind of stuff. But there gets to be this pattern of more and more tech being involved. eHarmony and Match.com, which is one of the older online dating sites that is now used by the older generation mostly. There's things like Tinder and OkCupid and that sort of thing that are becoming more and more common right now. There's also people, and I find this really, really interesting, there's people who dated a very traditional way many years ago, and through a series of situations is now back in the dating world. And so they were very traditional in the past, and now in rejoining the dating scene are now trying some of these apps like Tinder and Match.com and things like that. So their way of dating has completely transformed. And that's an interesting thing to me because what it tells us is it's not necessarily about the generation themselves, about us and our personalities and how we want to interact, although that's part of it. It tells me that a big piece of this is also having to do with the way the world functions, what's available to us, that this person who dated very traditionally a while ago is now dating through an online service because that's what makes sense in today's world. Not that they as a person are now part of a different generation or anything like that. I also, somebody put on here that that the way that they date is they don't. So that's really interesting. Is this idea that I don't date? I skip that, which is interesting idea. I'm not sure exactly what they meant by that. And then somebody else said that I don't date a lot. I have like long-term relationships, which is this interesting dichotomy where it's like, well, we don't date, we have relationships instead. And what does dating mean versus a relationship, which I think is also something that could be considered a generational sort of thing. But that's really interesting that different generations have experienced dating in a different way, and that's just one really clear example of how the world has changed and the way we interact with it. Travel. The way we travel, I think, says a lot, once again, about the way that the world has changed and how that has changed our experience and our perception of a lot of different things. So a lot of the older generation tends to put things down about how they would go on road trips and traveling was kind of a big deal, but they would do it, and they list some of the trips that they were on, possibly in college, or I've had a couple of reporters say, we did all of these trips, and talk about how when they were reporting on news stories however many years ago, they went traveling, but it was a big deal, and they were completely disconnected while they were traveling for work. And how now it's not really a big deal to anyone that they're traveling, and they're constantly connected, so it doesn't feel like they're that far away. Well, you have younger generations who have that second experience as well, as traveling is normal. It's not a big deal. I started traveling as a child and I've flown a lot and it's not a big issue. And so that goes to show once that the generation that's coming up now, the millennials and the Gen Zers, have a much smaller world. Everything is much more closely connected. And so there's much fewer boundaries, right? It's travel is more normal. The difference in citizenship, the difference in country of origin, all that kind of stuff isn't as big of a deal for us because we haven't had to deal with it quite as much. First jobs. This one is also super fun because the first jobs people have are so random. They're so random. So there's the traditional like lifeguarding and delivering newspaper and that kind of stuff, ice cream scoopers. There's somebody who was a dog sitter. Those sorts of very very normal sorts of things that people did. But then there's some like really obscure things that come up, which I just find really fascinating. This idea of, oh, I did commercials, right? Like that's kind of random. But as you progress in age, so the oldest generations, their experience of their first jobs tend to be much earlier in life. And tend to become more have higher levels of responsibility much earlier on than people in my generation, and especially younger than me, whose first jobs were often not until much later in life. And so you talk to people who are about my age, and we were still people who got our first jobs at like 16 and stayed working through much of our lives. But you talk to people on the younger millennial side, and they often were told to wait to get their first job. They had to be in school and they had to be studying and being involved in extracurriculars. And a job did not seem important because you couldn't put it on your resume, on your applications in the same way as other things. And so this is really important when talking, especially to older generations who are frustrated in what they see as a lack of work ethic, a lack of responsibility, a lack of professionalism in the younger generation. It's really important to recognize that you, especially as you get older and older, not only do you have more years of experience because you've had more years in the workforce since you were 18, but you had more experience in responsibility and being in the workforce even before you got to high school. You got to college. So our generation, we first get our experience in work a lot of times in high school, after that in college. And so we have a couple of years of working in college, and then we go right into a full-time salaried position. And people are frustrated that we don't have as much of a work ethic or an idea of responsibility. And all that has to do with is the fact that we haven't had a chance to develop it. We haven't had the time that it takes to develop it. And now this is unfortunate, but once again, there's not much we can do about this reality. It's not like there's another generation just sitting waiting for us to screw up and fail so they can come and take our jobs, right? We have our generation, the millennials, 75% of the workforce coming up. We have to figure out how to make it work. And one of the really important things is that we recognize that it's going to take some more intentionality in teaching us how to be responsible, how to be professional, how to have the kind of work ethic that is expected, not because we're lazy or entitled, but because we haven't had the chance to learn these things. Financial independence. Now, I find this one really funny because anytime there's people younger than me, it's like, what is that? Like, what is financial independence? I have no idea what we're talking about, or I do, but it's going to be years before I actually experience that. The idea of financial independence, and it correlates strongly with the last one, which is the idea of college, has changed incredibly in the last decade or two. It wasn't too long ago that you could pay your way through college, you could get a job in your field, you could get a little house and start a family really early on. Like that was something that you could sort of expect after you got out of college. That is not the reality now. There's no way that is the reality for a huge portion of the millennial population. We have huge student loans that we are trying to figure out how to pay off. A lot of us still live with our parents, not because we want to, not because we're lazy, but because we need to be there. We need to be able to have cheap or free rent so we can pay our student loans. So this idea of financial independence and when it starts in life has changed a lot. And that also adds to this problem of responsibility, right? Is we can't afford to be doing a lot of these things that help to build this sense of responsibility and knowledge and that sort of a thing because we don't have the financial means to do it. College is a big deal right now. Everyone's talking about how expensive college is in the US. And there's a reason for it. College is super expensive, and it is slowing down the rate at which we get homes, we get cars, we have children, we get married, all of those things. College affects that. And because of that, it also affects our responsibility levels, and it also affects the amount of income we need to or feel we need to make from our jobs. So I hear from a lot of HR people who are part of interview processes that millennials are really entitled because they're always asking about salary and benefits and all of these things earlier in the process than HR staff think they should be. And that might be true, and millennials need to figure that piece out. But part of the reason they might be doing that is because we're worried. We need to know how much we're going to be making to know if we can pay our student loans, to know if we can pay our student loans and our car payment, those sorts of things. Equally important is this idea that college doesn't necessarily guarantee the job you want to have. It used to mean a lot, right? You had your college degree and you could probably find a job in your field within a few years. It's not the case anymore. A college degree doesn't mean you're going to get a job in your field. All right, so there's all of that information, all of that stuff that kind of weaves together. And the big idea there is that if we look at these papers and we see what our experience has been, and we see what we think other people's experience has been, one is sometimes our perception of others is not as kind as the perception we give to ourselves. And so if you found that on your other side of your sheet, there was a lot more negative terms than on your me side, you probably need to sit down with some people who have had different experiences from you and figure out why you have that negative perception, because the amount of positivity should be equal on either side. Because just because someone's from a different generation doesn't mean that they're not as capable or qualified as you. So if you find that your other side is decidedly negative in your perceptions, you need to start thinking through why that might be and what you need to untrain yourself. Also, it's super important that we recognize that generation is a piece of our culture, right? We were raised a certain way. And so when we talk about people being raised in different countries or in certain socioeconomic status or things like that, we're very aware that being raised in that way affects the way we live our life later. But we don't give that same sort of credit to the generation people are raised in. And I don't think that's fair. If you're raised in a certain generation, it will naturally affect the way you see the world. And you can't completely change that, nor should you want to. The way we are raised colors who we are later. And so it's super important that we are not expecting other people to change to be more like us. I should not expect baby boomers and Gen Xers to be more like me and my generation. What I need to be doing is doing what I can to appreciate them, and hopefully that will come back to me as well. And it goes reverse. Do what you can to appreciate the experience of the other so it can come back to you on the other end. I know, why is there a picture of sandwich and soup? That's so random. I use this picture and this idea in almost every session that I do because it is such a helpful metaphor in understanding big picture, why there seems to be such a difference between the millennial generation and like everybody else. So when you think about the way your life looks, let's start with the sandwich side. Years ago, when people were growing up, the Gen Xers and the baby boomers, and definitely the greatest generation, your life would get layered. So you would get out of bed, you would go and eat breakfast, you would drive to work, you would do some work, you might have a phone call with someone, you'd go to lunch, you do some more work, you'd come home, you'd eat dinner, you'd talk with your family, or maybe go out with your friends. Everything had its place, and it was neatly differentiated. So some stuff kind of went together, but everything had its spot, and you put it all together and it was something wonderful, right? Today's world, the way that millennials have experienced the world is like soup. So everything doesn't have its place. We just have all of this stuff that is happening. We have our job and our friends and our relationships and our family and all of this stuff, and it gets thrown into a pot and mixed up. So you have, your millennial who gets out of the bed in the morning, but before they even got out of bed, they might have been on their phone, and they're eating breakfast, but they might be finishing homework and listening to music at the same time. And they go to school or work, and they're doing their work, but they're also interacting with other people, either in person or online or on their phone. Maybe there's a phone call. Everything is getting mixed up. And so you can still tell things apart, but it doesn't have its neat little place. It's all sort of mixed together. So this is why, a millennial is generally more okay with bringing work home in the evening, or making phone calls, or sending out an email on a Sunday morning, or things like that, because everything gets mixed together in our minds. So that's cool, because I know that I sometimes call my mom during work because that's when it's convenient for her, and everything is mixed together. Whereas when everything is neatly in its place, and you're left the sandwich paradigm, you're supposed to bring work home. Well, that's not where work goes. It's in the wrong space. Like, you can't put your tomato there. That's the wrong spot. It has to go somewhere else. So that difference is really important to understand, because when I'm working with people who come from definitely a much older generation, it's important for me to recognize that they tend to have had the experience of layering. It's not that they can't do it differently, but that is the automatic, right? You have to intentionally do something different if that's the way you have trained your brain to work. The older generation needs to understand that the millennial has been trained to mix everything up. And so if you tell the millennial, no Facebook, no social media, no phones, none of this talking to other people, you are here to work and just work, it's a conscious difference in our brain that we have to make. So those two things are super helpful. All right, so this is just a little teaser for the webinar that's coming up next week, and there's also going to be some live trainings on this as well, but this is about work-life balance. I don't love this term, but it's useful. Just go ahead and in the chat box, let me know which of these pictures most reflects the way you think about making your life happen the way you want it to. So when you look at these 4 different images, which one speaks to you as like, yep, that's the way I structure my life. That's the way I try to make everything have its place. Mm-hmm. All right, I see a couple of B's, much more D's. Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you can keep putting things in. It's interesting to ask this question of different groups, and this is primarily a U.S. audience. But when the audience becomes international, that actually changes the answers a little bit, because, well, B is obviously the scenario of the past, right? You got your work on one side, you got your life on the other side, and you're like trying to make it balance, and that's what you're trying to do, is make everything balance. Well, we've moved past that in a lot of ways, because once again, a lot of times there's soup. You don't know how to balance things. So D has become more popular. Is this idea, well, there's lots of different pieces, and I'm just trying to keep them all going the way that they're supposed to, right? Like, don't drop any of them. Keep everything up in the way it's supposed to. C is also a fairly popular one, and I see that C tends to be most popular among the youngest people. Is this idea of, I have all of these pieces of my life, and I'm going to keep fitting them together until they fit the way they need to for me. So that may mean I have more pieces that are work related, and a lot of pieces for family, and just a few pieces for friends, but it doesn't matter. As long as everything fits and there's a good picture in the end, that's cool. And A isn't as popular yet. I'm wondering when it's going to start getting there, and if I get into a certain group, if that's going to happen. And A is more this idea of like work and life just kind of spin around each other. They're always kind of happening. One takes more of their time than the other, and you kind of go back and forth between them, and they're just kind of spun. Maybe that one is a little too complex to really be popular yet. But this idea, the fact that B is so rarely used, goes back to this idea that the world is changing and the way everyone interacts with work is very different than it used to be. And so, yes, millennials are a big piece of that, but it's everyone who is looking at the way we work differently. All right, so it wouldn't be a true session if there weren't some facts that came in. So I love to do activities and have interactive things that are going on, but it's also very helpful to have some stats, especially if you ever need to go back to someone in charge with a reason you need to change something. Some stats are really helpful. So just a few stats that might be useful to you. One is the obvious: 3/4 of the workforce in the next 10 years, right? Millennials make up a lot of our staff very, very soon. So if your company does not figure out how to get them, how to keep them, and how to make them productive, your company is not going to be functioning 20 years from now. There's very little possibility for it to be working well. Millennials are well educated. We're the most educated generation. Now, if you look at the blast statistic, that doesn't necessarily mean it's helping us get jobs. So half of us work in jobs that don't require a degree. So we have the most education, but we're finding the least, not use for it, but the least value for that education. This is really helpful to understand when people, especially millennials, are entering more entry-level jobs. They're at a place where their knowledge level is much higher often than people in the past. And so that's something to be aware of, is that a lot of those sort of mundane tasks that you would ask your entry level staff to do in the past might be pushing your millennial staff out the door because they're much more educated. And that doesn't mean they can't do those mundane tasks, but it means they want their brains to be worked a little bit harder. Millennials have huge spending power. So if you're at this session not because you work with millennials, but because you are trying to sell to millennials, that's really important, is that millennials have a ton of spending power, which is crazy because we never feel like we have enough money, right? We're very insecure in our finances, but we still have to spend money. So we have a lot of spending power. And half of us make purchases on our smartphones. So we use our phones to buy things. There's a lot of talk about how millennials are killing so many industries. Part of that is because we're online, right? We don't see a reason to go into a store if you can go online and get the same thing without making the trip and spending the time and having the possibility of buying extra things while you're at the store. All right. We had talked a little bit about the financially aware and insecure idea of that we've got a lot of debt, we've got a lot of loans, and we are not guaranteed the job we want. And so there's that insecurity. The second thing here is, I think, really valuable, and I think this is missed often. It's this idea that we've had information available to us always, right? Like my phone right here, it has almost all of the information in the world. And so I can find out almost anything. And if I have the critical thinking skills to figure out how to use that information, I can do pretty much any job you ask me to do. That's really important to know about, especially your entry-level millennial employees. You can ask them to do things and they can find out information. Now, the soft skills of how to figure out how to get that information, the soft skills of knowing how to be professional about it, the soft skills of knowing when to ask for help and when to not ask for help, that's something you need to train on. But the actual information side, we can find it. We've also experienced American decline. I think that's an incredibly important one for corporations to realize. One of the reasons, we might be hopping jobs so much. Now, we don't hop jobs any more than any other generation did at this stage in life. So yes, boomers and Xers are staying in their jobs much longer than us, but back when they were our age, they stayed for 2 years as well. So I think that's something that needs to be put out there as well, as we're staying about the same length. But we also experienced American decline. What that means is we saw our parents losing their jobs after however many years they were loyal to a company, and it didn't matter. That loyalty didn't matter. We figured out that the company would do what was best for the company. And so we are very aware of that, and we're trying really hard to position ourselves to be valuable to the company, which is one of the reasons we're always asking how we can contribute, and to be prepared for when the company doesn't need us anymore, that we have skills and we have developed professionally to be able to transfer to a different job. Okay, so a couple of more things. Your Post-its, if you have Post-its. If you don't have Post-its, you can just use paper, that's fine. On this Post-it and a couple of Post-its, what I would really like is for you to write down an overgeneration or a stereotype, sorry, not generation, generalization, or a stereotype that you know people make about you because of your culture in some way, whether that's generation, whether that's gender, whether that is your ethnicity, something you know people think about you because of that. So a stereotype you either heard yourself or you hear in the media about you. So something, woman, emotional, right? I would put that down. I would write, I'm going to do that now. People think I am emotional because I am a woman. Pick a few things that you hear and write them on your Post-its. All right, everyone pretty good on that? Awesome. All right. So put these up somewhere where you will see them often. And this goes into tip number 3, the idea of don't assume people fall into the trends and the traps and the stereotypes of their generation. Put this somewhere where you will see it and use it as a reminder of, listen, people think this about me because of this piece of my culture. I don't want to be the person that assumes any of those stereotypes on anyone else. So I find that when I have Post-its like this and I have them places, it reminds me, you know what? Somebody thought I was emotional because I was a woman, and that does not feel good. So I need to make sure that when I'm interacting with a baby boomer, I don't assume that they're technologically illiterate. They might be perfectly fine. They might be able to teach me things. So put these up in a few different places in your home, or put them next to your computer as reminders not to do that to other people. And I'm all about reminders because, listen, we've all done these sorts of webinars, these sorts of trainings, or even like full day in-person trainings where you do all of these activities, and some of them you learn a whole ton of amazing things. Then you go back to your office with like a stack of papers and you throw them away, right? Like this training is over and you forget about it. And that's the way our brains work. The way our brains are wired is, you know, we hear a lot of stuff, we remember very little of it. We interact with some stuff, we remember a little bit more. But if we take things like the Post-its and we put them places, we get that reminder again. And so that's what this note to self is, this envelope, and you have one more piece of paper. It's this idea of you're going to forget a lot of what we talked about. You're going to forget those little nuggets that you want to take away with you. You know, some of this stuff might have been very basic to you. You already knew it. But in the course of the hour, there's almost always one or two things that you pull out, no matter what sort of conversation is had, that is going to be helpful to you. And so write those on your piece of paper, put them in this envelope, and put a stamp on it, or if you don't need a stamp, then don't use the stamp. And you can either put a note to yourself, which is the easiest one to do, or you can write it as a note to somebody you trust to hold you accountable. So a couple of nuggets. I was at a training recently where the big takeaway for me was to pay closer attention to the details of the people I meet with. So I meet with a lot of different people when we're talking about having me come into their companies and do trainings and that kind of things. And I've found And this training reminded me of this, that I remember the people and their jobs, but I don't pay as much attention to the details of their lives, the things they like, the things they enjoy, the problems they have, as I would like to. So I write a note and I say, I would like to remember to do this thing. All right, so this thing would be, I would like to remember to write down a couple of key, unique things about this person that I want to remember and I want to know. And then I address it to myself, I put a stamp on it, and I didn't mail it right away. So I put it somewhere where I would remember I had it. And then I mailed it about 3 weeks later, I think. And then it came to me pretty quickly. And it was just a good reminder. You can, like I said, send it to somebody else. Tell them, hey, this thing happened. We had this session. And I would like you to remind me to do this thing, because otherwise I'm not gonna, right? I'm gonna forget, or I'm going to get super involved in things and I'm not going to do this. So take a few minutes. I'll stop talking for a little bit so that you can write this note for yourself. All right, while you're finishing that up, just the last tip of the day is this idea that the younger generations, and every generation really, wants constant feedback. So this isn't a new phenomenon. Everyone has wanted, for every generation, to know how they're doing, to know what they can do better, to know what they're doing really well. The difference in today's generation is we're used to having it. So everyone's wanted it, but the millennials are used to getting it, right? We turn in a paper and it's a day or two and we know what our grade was, whereas other generations had to wait till the quarterly report to find out what their grades were. That sort of a thing. And so every generation has wanted this, but we are used to it. And so if you don't give us the opportunities to get constant feedback, we get really frustrated because we know it's possible. We know we can have it. We're just not given it anymore. And so do what you can to regularly offer feedback. And I love Postits. So that's one of the ideas that I often give people is, giving feedback can seem like a lot of work. And sometimes you give feedback and it becomes clear that your millennials don't realize that's what you're doing. So make a habit of every day just putting on a Post-it note somebody's name, something you notice specific about what they were doing well, and go and put it on their computer or at their desk, and tell your staff that that's what you're doing, that you're trying to give feedback more often, but you find your time getting away from you. So you're doing something like this. They will really appreciate it. That small step towards more feedback is super helpful. Okay, so that is basically the content for today. Hopefully it was really, really helpful and really useful to you. If it wasn't, that's okay, right? We're all at different places, asking different questions, needing different things. If you are looking for deeper information, sign up for another webinar or training. You can go to my events page. This is the first conversation to have. And I have a lot of other trainings that go deeper into different areas like tech and work ethic and that kind of thing. You can sign up for my newsletter. It goes out once or twice a month. And that just has some really helpful resources. And it also includes most of the events that are happening in each month. Some of them get missed because they get scheduled a little later. And then connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit. I really appreciate it as a social media platform. I think there's a lot of really good conversation that happens over there. So I'm on it almost every day, and you can connect with me there. You won't see everything that I'm doing because of algorithms, and I won't see everything that you're doing because of algorithms. But it's a place where there can be a back and forth instead of just a me sending you info. I will leave that link up for a little bit longer in case you need it. The link to sign up for the newsletter is also on my site. So if you go to the site, it's not a big deal. You can find it pretty quickly. Okay. And today's session was this very first one, this perception idea, and the other 5 are scheduled for different times this month. I think that work ethic is not going to be until November, but the other ones, there are opportunities to be a part of them as well. And thank you for joining. I appreciate whenever anyone wants to learn more about why my generation might be struggling in their workforce, might be struggling with whatever is going on in their company. And so it's really wonderful when people take the time to really strive to understand a generation that's not their own, or even their own generation from a different perspective. If you would be willing to, I would really appreciate emails that especially include critical feedback. What was good about the webinar? Absolutely. I love having my ego built up, but also what things were really missing, or were too surface level, or were too hard to understand, or if I talk too much, or if the lighting really isn't the way it needs to be and you'd prefer something different. Definitely let me know. Send me an email. I would really, really appreciate that feedback. I am constantly striving to make these more useful for people in the future, because this is a big issue and we have a lot of conversations that need to happen, and hopefully I can be a part of solving this problem. Okay, I'm going to, we're finished a few minutes early, but I think that's totally okay. I'm going to open the chat up so everyone who decides to stick around can be talking to each other. So give me a second and I will do that. All right. So everyone should be able to talk to each other now. Please shoot me questions that you have. I'll stick around until people start to leave completely. All right.